Hello and welcome back to Bookish. Today I want to do a review of Great Escapes from Detroit by Joseph O'Malley here on BookTube. Joseph O'Malley is also known as Untitled Latrec. I'll leave a link to his channel down below where you can find some videos about his book and his writing of the book. This book was published by Cornerstone Press and I got my copy through Amazon. Untitled Latrec wants to emphasize that because of the current pandemic situations, this book is also available as an ebook, and I'll try to leave links to those things as well as Joseph's channel, or as well as Untitled Latrec's channel down below. So there are 8 stories in this book, and there are 8, as with almost any short story collection, the 8 stories for me kind of varied in interest and quality, but overall I thought the stories were really very good. As is true, I think, with a lot of fiction, the stories in Great Escapes from Detroit deal with characters who I think are longing for something, and what they're probably longing for, and this is probably an oversimplification and maybe just a result of my own brain not working very well, is what they're longing for is some kind of escape. Not necessarily escape physically from Detroit, as the name implies, even though that story is not exactly doesn't exactly get that title for that reason, but an escape from the lives that they feel like they're forced to lead. Some are successful in escape, and some are not. Some of his characters, kind of just fell into a life that's incredibly limited, that seems like an endless repetition of the same days over and over again. They become increasingly frustrated until maybe they attack their neighbor with, a weed whacker, with a lawn tool. Some of his characters long to be accepted by their community, by themselves, by their friends, by their families. Some of his characters long to understand their family members better, whether it's a sister or a mother trying to understand her kid, or a father trying to understand and fearing that there's something deeply wrong with his son. They are, they are wanting something. They are longing for something, I'm just going to say different, longing for some kind of relief from the situation in which they find themselves. And oftentimes the characters who seem to survive Mr. O'Malley's stories the best are the ones that, and oftentimes the characters who survive O'Malley's stories the best are the ones who actually physically get out of Detroit itself. So I just want to talk about it here really quickly. 2 of my favorite stories from the book. Now, there are 8 stories in the book, and I would say that of the 8 stories, I think 7 of them worked for me really well, and 1 of them just didn't. And I think that's true with collection of stories in general. And I find that other people who read short story collections oftentimes find that, for them as a reader, they're kind of hit or miss, but 7 out of 8 is really good here. My 2 favorite stories are the first story is called The Collector. The Collector is about a young boy who collects cans and sells them to recycling centers. He uses the money to help his mother buy books for her mobile library, which she drives around to impoverished neighborhoods trying to provide children in those neighborhoods with resources for reading. He's also fighting to suppress his homosexuality, that he feels that that this is wrong, and he's trying to deny this part of himself whenever he has feelings for another boy or a man, or feels sexually attracted to a man or another boy his age. He punishes himself by giving his things away as a way of kind of trying to prevent that. He meets a friend of his sister's who works at a convenience store, one of the convenience stores where he collects and deals with his cans, and he is attracted to the young man who works there, and eventually he and this young man have a sexual encounter, which is, I have to tell you, is incredibly, I think, moving and beautiful and natural description of the way in which not only these kinds of just quick formative sexual or romantic encounters take place. It's one of the best one of those things I've read. I think it's the best thing in the book as a whole. You know, if you're just looking at one scene, this scene where, you know, the young man who is the collector and the young man who works at the convenience store have a sexual encounter, just felt like something that actually happened. And it was described in a way in which I think it could actually happen. And there's a naturalness, and there is a sense of relief, and there is a beauty in that description that I found to be really moving, and one of the most moving parts of that story. And even though the story ends in a tragedy, that scene, that part, left me feeling like the main character, the collector, was going to be okay. That, you know, he was moving beyond this desire to repress who he really was, and to punish himself for the feelings that he had. That at least momentarily he had gained some level of acceptance with himself and from others, and realized that he could fit in the world as the person he really was. And I really thought that was great. My other favorite story is the longest story in the book, and it's called Livonia. I believe that's how you pronounce it. Livonia is a suburban neighborhood around Detroit. And this tells a story of a young mother who moved to Detroit with her husband. She was a New Yorker, and she lives in a suburban home with her 3 kids. And her 3 kids do not seem to be particularly exceptional to her in any way. They are frequently described as being, you know, relatively well behaved, if kind of uninteresting, that they follow the same patterns over and over again. There's nothing unusual about them, and they're kind of symbolic, I think, of the way this woman views her life. She takes driving lessons because, as a New Yorker, she never learned to drive. She takes driving lessons, which I think are fairly effectively rendered and kind of funny. But you can see already, you know, keeping up with the theme of escape, that maybe she's taking these driving lessons as a way to escape from the life in which she's kind of found herself. She's not exactly unhappy, or she doesn't appear to be exactly unhappy until you realize that her husband, who is a radio personality, is suffering from severe bouts of anxiety and depression, cripplingly so, where sometimes he spends, you know, weeks at a time just laying in the bed in a darkened room, not moving, not watching TV, not really communicating. He rallies and gets up, but every time this happens, she becomes even more isolated. She's even more stuck. There's nobody she can tell about this, you know, and she has to end up being the only parent. She gets new neighbors, a mother, her 20-something daughter, and the 20-something daughter's son, and she becomes obsessed with this kid, finding him far more interesting and beautiful and clever than her own kids. She's obsessed with the kid, and she spends time trying to find out ways where she can, you know, almost get the kid to come over and play with her own kids just so she can be around him. Her kind of obsession with this kid is clear to the kid's grandmother, not so clear to the mother. And this becomes kind of a part of the theme of the story, that this you know, housewife is essentially, the thing she's latched onto is something different, is something new, is something exotic, as something liberating, is this kid himself. When her husband commits suicide and she prepares the funeral, it's at that moment she attempts to make her escape, Freudian slip, make her escape with this young boy, and taking advantage of her newfound driving skills. She attempts to do that, even though she does eventually return. I thought the story was really beautifully layered, that you got a real sense of the desperation that this young mother had, a sense of how everything in her life had kind of led her to this obsession, to her own kind of perhaps psychological break, and her own attempt to escape, only to be drawn back to the reality that was her life. Anyway, I really think these are good stories, and O'Malley can write. His characters are three-dimensional. His characters are not stock, you know, characters. These are kind of the people you feel like you know, even though you don't completely understand them. One of the great things I think is about O'Malley's stories is you can know these characters and you can understand some things about them, but there are things about them that I don't think you can completely know. There's a lot of detail, some of which sometimes seems extraneous until you realize that what O'Malley's doing here is creating a whole world of Detroit and the suburban areas around Detroit, and then kind of the desperation that people feel in this sort of economically depressed area, whether they are, suffering economically or not. I really like the stories. I think they're really well done. If you're interested, I hope you will pick up a copy of Great Escapes from Detroit, because I think the stories in there are, on the whole, really good. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comment section below, and as always, thank you for watching.